Hello, everyone. Can you hear me? Good. I'm Phyllis Nash, one of the co-chairs of Nelson Committee on Homelessness, and Cheryl Dowden, the other co-chair, is over here. Stand up, Cheryl. Great. Thank you for attending Nelson Committee on Homelessness' 10th annual report card launch. Nelson Committee on Homelessness, or NCO as it's generally known, is made up of about 20 members and are representing local citizens, agencies that provide services, representatives from government services, and representatives from the local government, which is a municipal government. The committee's been active for 17 years. And it was formed in response to a federal government initiative that designated 61 communities that had significant homeless populations to receive specific funding. Essentially, NCO is an advisory committee that focuses on the elimination of homelessness in our community. And over the years, funding's been directed as follows. So I just want to give you this list so you've got a kind of context for the report card. It provided the down payment for Ward Street in 2002, funding for the food cupboard and our daily bread for a number of years, and that started in 2003, and I think it lasted about 5 years. Funding for a youth outreach worker, and that was about 2 years of funding, I think, something like that. It provided this funding for stepping stones. It provided funding for 2 research projects, and these are all federal dollars that are come through the designated community stream. One was Faces of Homelessness in Rural Areas, Housing Issues and Homelessness in the West Kootenays and Boundary Region. And the second one was Roofs for Youth, and that was a regional project. And I've often thought recently that I should be looking back at those and seeing what those reports say compared to where we're at now, because they were done in about 2010. It also provided the showers and laundry facilities at the Salvation Army, and what that was is actually the rebuild of the jail cells that were in that building and the provision of the initial equipment, you know, the showers and the washers and dryers. And so that's the sort of past history, and currently the funding provides for a transition worker who assists individuals who are homeless to find permanent, stable, and safe housing. It supports Nelson's outreach program, sponsored by the Nelson Street Collaborative, and it pays for the coordinator of NCO, and that person is responsible for this report card. Her name is Ann Harvey, and she's at the back, and you all know her, and the Homeless Action Week in October, and the Connect Day in November. And I think all of these projects have been very valuable in addressing, at least assisting people who are living homeless. And it also has been very successful in a way of providing housing for people who are homeless and allowing them to move on with their lives. So we've got a long ways to go, as all of you in this room know very well. But I think we can be pretty proud of our accomplishments over the years, and I think it's a good foundation for continuing growth. And on that note, I'd like to introduce Ann.
Thanks so much for coming today. I just want to quickly go over the agenda and let you know, first of all, that the men's washroom is just through the door there on your right, and the women's washroom is through the hall, down to the end of the hall, and it's on your left. So today, we're going to be doing a bit of a presentation on the highlights of the report card. There's a lot in there, but we're going to try and touch on the highlights that really focus a lot around youth homelessness and housing precariousness. That were kind of the two major themes that came out of the report card. So Dylan will be doing a presentation on that. I'll hit then some of the usual community indicators that we track with each report card that have an impact on homelessness and poverty in town. And then we're going to have some short panel presentations by our guests who Phyllis will introduce when we're ready for that portion. And we'll open it up after that to some questions and answers and discussion around some of the things we've talked about today. So thanks so much for coming, and we'll dive in now. Did you want to introduce? Yeah. Oh, thanks.
Yes, Dylan is going to provide, Dylan Griffiths. That's awful. I couldn't remember his last name. Dylan's going to present the pit count, and he coordinated that whole effort. And this is the second pit count that's happened in Nelson. The last one was about 3 or 4 years ago? 2 years ago only? Okay, and so this is the second one that we've had. Pit being point-in-time count of people who are homeless in our community. Dylan?
Thank you, Phyllis. Let's skip this guy. Whew. Can everybody hear me reasonably well? Okay, so it's a survey, it's data. I have a lot of data to get through, so I apologize for that. It's going to be a bit of an information dump on you, but I'll try to make it as engaging as possible. So the pit count took place between 5 p.m. on April 10th and 5 p.m. on April 11th. We had about 65 volunteers going to locations throughout the community. That included the shelters, that included service locations like the Salvation Army, Our Daily Bread, that included street locations, Ward Street down by the mall. We also had youth workers that were doing the survey with their clients. We also had people at the school, people at the college. So we tried to get a great cross-section of the community. So during that 24-hour period, we approached 725 different people. Of these, 101 agreed to take the survey. There's also 7 dependent children who were dependent on those survey participants. 24 other people were observed to be homeless. So some of those were people that were staying in shelters or in transitional housing facilities, or some facility where the staff knew that they were homeless, or there was a really good reason that our volunteers had to believe that those people were homeless. So that was a total of 132 people experiencing homelessness in Nelson on the night of April 10th, 2018. That's up from 116 in the 2016 count. And there's not a lot we can say about that change. It's a little too early with just having 2 data sets to sort of start speculating about trends. We did have some changes in methodology, particularly around youth engagement this year, which will impact the numbers. But as Phyllis mentioned, what we do know is these are only the people that were willing to speak to us and who were in the sort of downtown core, accessing services, or in the downtown core during that 24-hour period. So the number is actually higher than that. So where did people stay that night? 20 people had no shelter whatsoever. They were camping, sleeping in cars, sleeping on the street. 28 stayed in shelters, so that's Stepping Stones and the Amy Ballo Transitional Shelter for Women. 18 stayed in some sort of transitional housing facility. Most of those are youth and their children who are staying at Cicada Place. 2 people stayed in institutions, so either jail, detox, hospital, or McKim Cottage or Daily Pavilion. And then 21 people didn't know where they stayed, or didn't want to stay, or their answer didn't really fit into any of these categories. So who were these people that were homeless on April 10th? 38% were female, 54% were male, 7% identified as two-spirit, trans, non-binary, or gender neutral. 26% identified as bisexual, pansexual, lesbian, or other non-heterosexual sexual identity, which is a really significant number given that the population, it's about 3% of the general population is LGBTQ2S. So we know that that LGBTQ2S people are vastly represented in the homeless population because of discrimination, getting booted out of the house early, intolerance, all these sorts of things. 31% of the people that we surveyed identified as having Indigenous ancestry, and the number for Nelson for Indigenous ancestry is around 5.5% of the population. So this is pretty consistent with what we're seeing around the country in terms of vast overrepresentation of Indigenous peoples within the homeless community, and this has to do with displacement from land, disconnection from community, historical trauma, as well as ongoing discrimination and racism in Canada. 8% of those we surveyed had experience in the Canadian military or the RCMP. Again, this overrepresents the numbers. About 2% of people in BC are veterans. So once again, we're seeing people who have got experience of trauma who are vastly overrepresented in the homeless population. Where do they come from? So there's a conception or perception in Nelson that a lot of the homeless problem, for lack of a better term, is imported. That people come here because we have services here. People come here because it's a good place to be homeless. 40% of the respondents have lived in Nelson for at least 10 years. 55% have been here for at least 5 years, and a full 68% have lived in Nelson for a year or longer. So to the question of where do they come from Nelson. They are us. They are members of our community, and they've got long-standing ties. Of those people who have come here in the last 5 years, the majority of them came here because they have family connections to the community, and that's why people are coming to Nelson. So we're going to look a little bit into the pathways into homelessness and why people are experiencing homelessness. So the reasons for loss of housing, 34% indicated some sort of conflict or abuse with their parents or guardians or spouse or partners that led to homelessness. 34% had some sort of tenancy issue, unsafe housing, conflict with landlords or roommates, or rent evictions. And they could choose more than one answer to this question. So when you notice that the percentages are above 100%, that's why. 24% had financial difficulties that contributed to their loss of housing. Unable to pay rent, they lost their job or some sort of reduction in income or benefits. And 23% had health issues, illness, hospitalizations, or addiction issues that led to the loss of homelessness. 21% indicated other reasons. Aging out of care is quite a key one. Other answers or declined to say, or their answers were unclear. So housing instability was another thing that we looked at this year, and this was something new for this year's survey. We got a lot of feedback from our community partners that a lot of people were really experiencing difficulties maintaining their housing. So we can't actually ask about housing in the survey itself because it's for people that don't have housing. So we added a question to the screening tool for people that do have housing about the stability of that housing. So the question was, are you concerned that your current housing may be at risk in the immediate future for any of the following reasons? And those reasons were unable to pay rent or mortgage, concerns about personal safety, end of lease or rental term, health or safety issues such as, so these are health or safety issues with the building itself, the physical environment, so fire hazard, mold, bad wiring, all that kind of stuff, or conflict with roommates, families, partner, which would include abusive situations as well. 360 people of the 725 that we approached answered this question. Of that 360 people, 107 indicated that they had one or more of these risk factors. So this isn't just a matter of your regular sort of financial anxiety. This is, I don't know how I'm going to pay the rent next month. That's the kind of level of imminent loss of housing we're looking at here. So that's a really significant number. If you're looking at 132 people who are currently homeless, add another 107 who fear that within the next month or two they could also be homeless, that's a pretty significant issue. So just to give you a sense of where these people were landed on their concerns, 52, this was the biggest concern, feared they would be unable to pay their rent or mortgage. 12 had concerns about their personal safety. They were in some sort of conflict, abusive situation, drug use in the home, something along those lines. 41% were coming to the end of their lease or rental term and didn't have anything lined up when they were leaving their current residence. 26% had health or safety issues with the physical environment, so poor housing conditions. And 22% had some sort of interpersonal conflict with roommates, family members, or partners that they were concerned were going to lead to the loss of housing. So once people are without housing and are searching for housing, some of the barriers that are keeping people from finding housing in Nelson. 25% indicated some sort of mental health issue that was impacting their ability to find housing. 27% indicated poor housing conditions, so they just couldn't find suitable, safe housing in their price range. 29% said bad roommates. So in Nelson, we have a lot of shared housing, a lot of roommate situations, and that can be really challenging for people. It can just be a real challenge for people that really need their own space. 29% as well indicated some sort of family conflict that led to the loss of their housing. 63% indicated that they did not earn enough money to be able to afford housing. And the number one answer, I don't think, will be a surprise to anyone: rent's too high. 82% could not afford rents in Nelson or stated that there was not enough supported affordable housing in Nelson. We also asked people about the service requirements that they had. So the sort of supports that they need in their life living without housing, as well as to help them access housing. So 27% indicated they wanted some services around addiction and substance use. 42% indicated they wanted services around tenants' rights and housing supports to help them access, find, and keep housing. 47% indicated they needed eye care. And this may seem like sort of a tangential thing around housing, but just imagine if you can't see, you can't read, you can't really get around, you can't read the classified ads to look for housing. It just really impacts every part of your life. 51% had mental health concerns that they needed help with. And the number one was a bit of a surprise, although not to the service providers who suggested this one. Dental care. 55% need help with dental care. Dental care isn't covered, and it can really impact people. It impacts, there's a level of pain that can be really debilitating. There's a presentation matter. If you're looking for housing and jobs and you're missing a lot of teeth, that can be a real barrier for people. And there's self-esteem issues that go around that, and that sense of being a stigma around dental, needing dental care. So it really does impact housing and employment. Okay, so the barriers to accessing services, those were the services people needed, indicated they needed, and then we wanted to know, why are you not getting the services you need? 19% said they had an addiction or had substance use issues that were preventing them from accessing services. Similarly, 19% were ineligible for services. So this could be they're new to the province and they can't access health care yet. They're not old enough to get into Stepping Stones. Stepping Stones is a 19 years and older only shelter. There is no emergency youth shelter in Nelson at the current time. So those are some of the reasons people would be ineligible. Discrimination. Income discrimination was a big one that people indicated, but all forms of discrimination would apply here. Physical disability or a health issue that's preventing people from getting to the services they need. Can't afford the services, 35%. And a big one is lack of transportation. People who rely on bus services to get to appointments, particularly if they're having to get to medical appointments in Trail, for example, that can be a huge barrier. And if you've got any kind of mobility issue, getting around on the bus, it can be quite the challenge. Okay, so now we're going to jump into youth homelessness, which was, as I said, a focus this year. We worked really closely with our youth partners to better engage with youth and get a better picture of what youth are experiencing in Nelson. So 32% of those surveyed were youth under 24. So that's a pretty significant chunk of our homeless population in Nelson. But I think even a more striking statistic is that 56% of those who indicated they were homeless now first experienced homelessness before the age of 19. So when we talk about pathways into homelessness, those pathways are starting at a young age. People are struggling as children and as youth, and they're not getting the supports preventatively to keep them from becoming homeless when they become adults. 40% of all respondents have lived in foster care or a group home, and that goes up for youth. 54% of youth respondents have had some engagement with the foster care system. So once again, these are youth that are connected to care, but are still ending up in homelessness. Oh, and that's me being out of time, so I got to talk really fast now. Okay, so when we talk about youth, one of the key things with youth is something we call hidden homelessness. So youth are often they're not in the shelters because we don't have an emergency shelter for youth. You don't always see youth on the streets. Youth are really resilient and really good about finding places to sleep, and so they do a lot of couch surfing, and this is what we call hidden homelessness. And when we're talking about couch surfing, we don't mean they're crashing at a friend's place, they've been up late watching movies and I'm going to sleep on your couch. It's because they don't have a safe place to go, safe and stable housing of their own. They're staying at their friend's place because they can't go home, or they don't have a home to go to. And youth tend to bounce from couch to couch to couch, so they'll be staying in temporary situations. You know, I'll stay with one friend for a week, and then I can stay at this place for a few days, and then I can stay at this place for a few days. It's really precarious. It makes it really hard to be in school, to be looking for work. Often they can be compromised situations of places they're staying may not be safe, and they'd be willing to compromise their safety for the sake of a warm bed, particularly in the wintertime. So this is the Homeless Hub definition. Hidden homelessness refers specifically to people who live temporarily with others, but without guarantee of continued residency or immediate prospects for accessing permanent housing. 57% of youth crashed at someone else's place the night before. So this is of the youth we surveyed on April 10th. 57% had stayed at someone else's place the night before, and 75% had done this sometime in the previous 12 months. So yeah, so even the youth who are currently in transitional care who are staying at Cicada, who may have come in the last year, their story prior to coming in was one of hidden homelessness and bouncing from place to place and being really precariously housed. And just a little more data around the youth. As I said, 54% have been in foster care. 43% of youth identify as LGBTQ2S. So if we're remembering that statistic, 3% of the general population, but 43% of youth are part of that population. So what we're looking at there is likely experiences of discrimination, not feeling safe and welcome in their own homes. 50% of youth in Nelson, homeless youth in Nelson, have lived here for at least 5 years. The number one contributing factor to youth homelessness was conflict with parents or guardians. So again, back to the LGBT question, or just generally, they don't feel safe in the parental home. And the number one barrier to youth finding stable housing is 93%. The rent's too damn high. The top 3 service needs for youth experiencing homelessness in Nelson: mental health at 50%, 47% housing supports, tenants' rights, and 32% some form of temporary housing. And again, temporary employment. And I think temporary employment rather than permanent employment, again, that speaks to the precariousness of their bouncing from one situation to one situation. When you're doing that, to hold down a permanent full-time job is not realistic. So being able to get a temporary employment where they can pop in, do a day's work, get a bit of money, that's sort of what they're looking at there. And just to close my portion of this, just a couple quotes. So these are comments that youth made when they took the survey. We need a whole apartment for youth coming out of care with strong life skills training or support. We do have Cicada Place. Cicada Place has 10 units. And as we saw, we have many more than 10 youth that are needing those services in this community. And then the other quote here: I'd like to see a housing option or a center that provides drop-in services like food and temporary stays for youth in precarious housing situations. Boom, that was a whole lot of information. I'm sorry to have to go through it so quickly. We're gonna sort of tease that apart for the rest of the presentation here, and then we'll have time for questions at the end so we can elaborate and clarify some of those points. Thanks.
Thank you, Dylan. That was actually a very efficient presentation with an incredible amount of data. Anne Harvey is going to come and join us now to talk about the highlights of the key community indicators.
Can you show me how to do the...
Yeah.
Just that one, okay. Okay. So and I start, I just want to, I was remiss earlier to maybe recognize some of our special guests today, and I want to do that. And we really thank you for coming. There are 3 city councillors here today: Councillor Robin Cherbo, Councillor Janice Morrison, and Councillor Michael Daly. And so welcome, and thank you so much for coming. The city plays an important role in helping to grapple with these issues, so we really appreciate your attention to these matters. Also, I'd like to acknowledge Constable Sean Zakowski, who's the beat cop downtown, for coming. He's been doing a great job, and again, it's a great partnership there. I'd also like to acknowledge Mr. Kerry Clark, who's VP General Services at Selkirk College. Certainly youth homelessness impacts students as well, and in that regard, I'll acknowledge Gabrielle Faludi, who's from the Students' Union, who's here today as well. And there's a couple or 3 different instructors from Selkirk as well, so we really appreciate your interest in these matters as well. And also I'd like to recognize Angela Guy, who is with Mental Health Services out of Interior Health, for her interest in today as well. A lot of the great partnerships we've had. Okay, more stats. I'm just going to whip through some of the factors that impact homelessness in Nelson that we track from year to year. So to no surprise to anyone who's here in the room probably, the vacancy rates have remained low from last year to this and are getting, well, worse. We have basically 0% vacancy across the board in all size of units that were surveyed by CMHC last fall, and some were so small they couldn't even sample them for studio and 3 bedrooms. And single room occupancy units, which used to be kind of a very common housing form for people who were of low or modest income, pretty well no longer exists. There's maybe a few units left in Nelson. The rental rates continue to climb. We did a survey of advertised rental rates and found particularly for 1 and 2 bedrooms, those are climbing. For 2 bedrooms and studios, actually, they've climbed 23 to 25% in the last 2 years. But studios declined a bit. I don't know if it was a market correction or more studios coming on the market, but they were down 9% this year. But still, it's a 23% increase over 2 years. So, you know, we're looking at rates of for advertised rents that are not in situ, that are covered by rent controls, but a new unit on the market or a new person on the market coming into the rental situation. We're looking at over $1,000 for a 1-bedroom unit that's advertised, and over $1,366 for a 2-bedroom unit. And you can see how that compares to the rent control units of CMHC in green surveys. So thank heavens there are some rent controls, but it's still climbing. The other thing we noticed in our rental survey is that shared living is on the rise. People are in search of affordable housing. In 2017, there were just 29 ads that we found in Nelson over a short period of time. It was almost double that this year. There were 49 ads we found around shared living situations, and of those, 30 of those were actually singles sharing together where there wasn't a landlord present. So what we're finding then is people teaming up to try and, you know, team together for affordability, basically. But that housing, especially in 2 and 3 bedrooms, 30 of them were lost then to family housing. So there's almost like out-competing some of the families and maybe driving the prices up a bit too, because you've got more income sharing that housing cost. Also, the census came out last fall for income information, and we've reporting then that 47% of Nelson renters pay over 30% of their income for housing. And that 30% is a kind of an accepted measurement by CMHC nationally about what is considered affordable. So almost half of Nelson is paying more than 30% for renters, 30% of their housing. And actually that, I think, goes up if you start including homeowners. At least homeowners get equity out of it. And because we're talking about youth, this report card, 24% of 0 to 17-year-olds were noted in the census of living below Canada's low-income measure. So that's a pretty significant percentage. When you compare incomes with what housing costs are, census found the median income in Nelson was $36,647. But if you pay 30% of that, you're allowing or affording only $916 a month for rent. And when you look at the advertised rental rate for a 1-bedroom, they can't even afford that. So what do families do? An interesting other trend that we found was that all the food banks and meal services were reporting a little bit of a decrease this year in the numbers of visits. Now, there's different reasons given for that. Often it's maybe program rearrangements going from twice a week to once a week. But there were some that that commented that they felt that the $100 a month increase that the BC government gave, which was one of their first actions when they got into government last fall, to people on income assistance and persons with disability, that it began to make a difference in people's lives. And this is something we really want you to take notice of, is that there are policy decisions and structural changes that can make a huge difference in people's lives, and that's already being noticed in some of the food providers in town. Because we're talking about youth, we wanted to report that kids 18 years and under made up 23% of the people that were receiving food at the food cupboard this last year, and that's up from 19% the year before. And the Salvation Army really has a good food program in reaching out to the community as well. So they served quite a number of kids and teens and school lunches in the past year as well. We did a survey of advertised rental rates in the region as well. And when we talk about shared living, precarious housing situations, and the fact that the income for a lot of people, if you notice in the report card, I didn't put it up here, but we do a comparison of minimum wages compared to what the rents are as well, paying 30% of your income. So if you're on minimum wage, if you're on a fixed income, it's really a challenge here, especially if you're a family. So all of this, plus the low vacancy rates, are pushing people out of Nelson and into the surrounding areas looking for more affordability. And we're noticing that increased pressure then on things like the transportation systems. There'll be more increased pressure, noted before, about people trying to get in for doctor's appointments or shopping or whatever. We noticed in the survey that 3-bedroom rentals were scarce everywhere in the region, everywhere. And we noticed that the rates were being bumped up in some of the surrounding places as well. Trail, 1 bedrooms up 23% from last year. Castlegar, 17 to 20% for 2 and 3 bedrooms. And Slocan Valley even for 2-bedroom units. So it's having an effect. And one hopes then that organizations like the regional district will take a look at this and say, maybe this is a shared problem regionally, and it's something we have to tackle as a whole. That's about it for me for now. Thanks so much for listening, and I'll give it back to Phyllis to introduce your panelists.